Welcome to Truly Terrified, Paranormal versus Physics, where we talk about some really weird stuff, and Joe the scientist explains how it's not possible, or maybe it is. I'm Lynn, and
I'm Joe.
Today we're going to talk about backyard graves because we have one in our backyard. But first, I did a little digging on the internet and found it's actually not that uncommon to have somebody buried in your backyard. So here's some examples. This story takes place in a beach town where there are several graves of children in one yard. I'm not sure where this beach town was, but there's a cliff if that matters. As the locals tell it, children died from some fever or a virus or something a few generations back. The father had some kind of beef or falling out with a local Methodist church, and he wouldn't have his children buried on the church ground. In the summertime, local kids would be down on the beach, and they'd hear this old piano up on top of the cliff where the house was, where it sounded like someone was just beating on the keys with their hands over and over and over, and there was no tune, just weird up and down the keys. The kids said they knew it was those dead kids, but they didn't think the adults understood that it was.
How did they know?
Kids. Well, they're kids. Kids think they know all kinds of stuff. No, they don't.
They suspect.
Right.
And could be wrong.
But it definitely, I can imagine being kids.
So here's another
going down to the beach.
Take on that. If I had however many 5 kids die, I'd go crazy. So maybe it's the guy wailing on the keys because he's nuts.
That is very, very true. Yes. I mean, yeah, you'd go crazy. Can you imagine? I can't even imagine.
That's horrible. That's the worst part about that.
Yeah, that is
not
horrible.
That there's creepy, spooky child ghosts.
This poor guy lost all his kids. Okay, so in the not too distant past, when America was mostly rural, farm families had their own cemeteries. On huge farms that owned slaves, they were buried there too. Some even had grave markers, but most just had a simple stone to mark the grave. There's a guy I know in Arkansas who took me out to a hill on his land, and on top of this hill, it was a very beautiful spot. There were several graves, and at least 2 of them were the graves of slaves. And it was interesting because they didn't have names on them; they had a number. So they had somebody chiseled a number. I guess because they didn't know their slaves by name, they just knew them like this was number 14 or something. I don't know.
That'd be crazy.
Isn't that weird?
Because it'd be harder to remember a number than to remember the name, especially because you can ask the other slaves. They know each other, obviously.
Yes, they know right. Yeah.
That's weird. I mean, it was super common, probably like the rule rather than the exception, for slave owners to know their slaves, right?
I'm sure they had to know their slaves.
On a personal level. Unless
they had a giant plantation and
unless it was massive.
Hundreds of slaves. It's just horrible. It's just a horrible thing to think about.
I don't know, the numbered grave thing, that's weird.
Yeah, it was really weird. And they were very small too, compared to the person who was probably a family member of the owner of that land where this hill was. They had their name and their dates there, and it was a larger stone. And these slave graves were smaller. They were like maybe a quarter of the size, and they were just etched in really crudely with a number. And maybe there might have been a date.
They buried them with a headstone.
Yeah.
So it's not like they just threw them into a pit. So if they took the effort to put up a headstone and everything,
why wouldn't they just put their name?
Why wouldn't they put their name?
I don't know. But it's all part of the whole mentality of having slaves, I think.
Yeah, maybe.
And also, I think probably the only reason why they took the time to bury them is because they considered themselves, and I'm making air quotes here, good Christians.
Oh, yeah.
And, that's what good Christians do, is they bury the dead, and probably gave them a Christian burial.
Do they bury animals?
Did they bury animals? They ate the animals.
Yeah.
So in Paragould, Arkansas, another guy, not the same guy with the hill and the slave graves, he was preparing an area to build a shed. And there'd been a shed in that spot before, so he was cleaning out the old stones that had been used for foundation. So imagine somebody getting flat stones and putting it around the perimeter where the shed was. And one of the stones, when he turned it over, it was actually a headstone. And the death date was 1979. That is pretty recent. So he did a little investigating, and he discovered that that the guy's death record, I'm presuming through the county or the health department, it said he died 3 years later than that date. And so this Paragold guy said he thought probably someone had been collecting the guy's benefits for a period of time after he died, buried him, put the headstone there, kept on getting the benefits, and then finally reported it, and so they made a record of it. But he used a divining rod to determine where the grave was. But did he actually find the grave, or did he just use a divining rod and say this is where the grave is?
Oh,
That
yeah,
is the question.
true.
Because he didn't say that anybody excavated the grave. I guess they don't call it excavating the grave.
So at what point do you say, okay, what I've done is confirmation of
Right.
this presumption?
Do you have to look at the bones, you know?
Well, I mean, like, okay, so you use your divining rod and you say, yes, here's the grave. You're 100% confident. Or you then say, okay, I'll put down a rod. So you push down a rod until it hits something hard, and you say, okay, that's confirmation. There's something
Except
down
that
there.
there's stone, so it could
Or
be a rock.
you say, okay, I'll dig it up, and then you see wood the top of a casket. You know, you're, okay, it's obvious there's something buried here. Or do you then open the casket and look at the bones? At some point, you're saying, oh, okay,
Yeah.
this is enough for me to confirm it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, another one was a family in Modesto, California, and they had a beloved pet die. They didn't say what kind of pet, but I'm assuming it was a cat or a dog because they were digging a fairly large hole. And this happened in 2022, so not that long ago. Modesto, California, pretty big city. So they dug the hole, and they found a human body in it. So immediately they called
happened to just be digging in this spot, and they found human bones.
human remains, yeah.
So they found bones, and they
It did
looked
not.
and-
It did not give a detailed description of what they found, but the police, because this was a news report, so the police were called. They came out, roped off the entire yard, came in with an excavator, excavated, dug up the whole yard.
And they did find bones. Or
There
they
was really a body there. Yeah, there was really a body. I couldn't find anything about what happened after, what kind of investigation they did or what they determined. But it probably, considering how the newspaper described the police coming and closing off the whole yard and everything, they suspected foul play. So a grave
Murder.
with murder, with no headstone, no marker. Yeah, and it must have been in some way fresh enough that I don't know. I really don't know. But they did say that it was shallow.
Yeah, that's a good indicator.
Yeah.
Unless there's something like, oh, the ground is eroding away, or the bones floated up, so they were more buoyant in maybe wet soil.
Yeah, Modesto, California, that wouldn't be the case. So, yeah, I don't know.
Or the people couldn't dig down. They hit a floor of gravel or rocks.
Yeah, but no marker on it.
Yeah, no marker.
Yeah. In Corpus Christi, Texas, a couple had just bought a house. They'd only been in it for 3 weeks, and they were picking around the backyard, and they discovered a military headstone in their backyard. They just left it there. Just,
Yeah, well, what else can you do? Because, as you know, it's expensive to move it.
Yeah, and it becomes complicated because it does become complicated. In another case, this case is interesting because it illustrates that finding a headstone in your yard doesn't necessarily mean that there's a body under it. It could just mean that the previous owner had found a headstone somewhere, I don't know where and I don't know why, and thought it was decorative, or that it would make a good foundation for a shed, or they liked the sentiment on it, or who knows. Or maybe they had a duplicate made of a loved one's headstone. So it doesn't necessarily mean there's a body there. So this one, the lady didn't go so deep to discover whether or not there was a body. But this was how this all came down. So she had lived in this house for a little while. She decided to dig a new flower bed in her backyard. she's digging, and there were lots of rocks, and one was really big and heavy. So she struggled and struggled and finally got it out of the ground, and it was kind of flat. She turned it over and discovered that it was a headstone. And she had a picture of it that she shared. And it was a very decorative headstone, and it said like mother and the person's names and dates and a little saying on it. It was very decorative. Obviously something that somebody would go to a lot of trouble to make. So, that could just be a decorative thing they put in their yard to remember their mother by.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe they put cremains under it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Do those have the same legality?
No, because you can sprinkle them lots of different places.
Yeah.
And the thing about cremated remains is that there's certain places they don't want you to do it, mainly because it's disturbing for other people. But also, if a whole bunch of people came, like a whole bunch of people wanted to throw the ashes out over Grand Canyon, you're going to
might cause some problems.
Yeah, it might cause some problems. Not to mention there's always people at Grand Canyon that would be disgusting.
Yeah.
So it's disgusting to have somebody else's dead parents' ashes
blowing in your face. Yeah, that's
like David could tell you about that. Okay, so she found that headstone, and the death date was 1958. So it had been there a while. So the thing about a headstone is this. They're not cheap. They cost some money. If you have it made of marble, it costs more. If you have it made of, granite, it costs a different amount. And to have it etched, in 1958, they didn't have like what we have now, where they probably just put them on some kind of a table and have a laser thing do it. But they didn't do that. They did it by hand. So to go to the expense of having a headstone made and using it as a decoration in your yard just seems, I guess it's possible, but it just seems kind of unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Or okay, here's another scenario. If somebody died, and like a couple, the mother died, and so they made a nice gravestone, says mother, blah, blah, blah. And then later the father dies, and then they want one headstone because they're side by side to encompass both of them. Okay, I could see that, where they make a new headstone to cover both of them, and then they take the one that just is for the mother and put it in their yard. I could see that. It could be something like that. But this is what she said. She said after she found the stone, she started having bad luck. Like almost immediately, her air conditioner went out. And then other things kept happening. Just bad luck things. So she no longer is digging flower beds. She talked to the local officials, and they say there is no body there. But she can't find any info on how they came to that conclusion. So it's not like...
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like they said, oh, well, we can confirm the body is here.
Mm-hmm.
They just said, nah, there's no body there.
Because no records, because they doused, because...
But the thing about no records is if you're burying somebody in your yard, you probably aren't going to seek out records.
Exactly.
You're just going to bury them in the yard.
So that is the one thing. It's like, at what point do you say, yes, I'm absolutely sure there isn't or is a body under this gravestone? Like, hell, even using it like a ground penetrating radar, it might show something, and it just is not quite... It'd be like you do it, and then someone decides, oh, actually, I'm going to dig it up and look. And if your evidence before says one thing, and you're surprised by the new thing, the new evidence, the new results, then that previous evidence wasn't enough. If you 100% always know your dowsing produces the right results, you'd never be surprised if when somebody digs it up, they find whatever. I wouldn't if I find a grave if I find a gravestone that's pretty good evidence there's a body under it, but
Well, so one thing I wanted to find out about is it legal? Can you even legally bury someone in your yard? And I discovered that although burial laws change from state to state, so they're different in all the states, they define it differently, however they put it down in their state laws. But most states, yeah, you can do it. You might have to do some other things to make sure it's legal, but you absolutely can. There's only 3 states that have absolutely outlawed home burial, and they are Indiana, California, and Washington.
It's a weird selection.
Yeah. Now, some of the people that I did a little digging into, they said things like they thought it was probably because of the real estate resale, it could be a problem. I don't know if laws like that are made for those reasons. I would think it'd be more concerned with accidentally digging up a body later, or groundwater issues.
Yeah, like in the South when they have flooding and it draws the bodies up.
I don't know if you remember this, but actually it might have even been before you were aware of such things. It might have been when you were a little tiny kid. There was flooding and lands and mudslides in California, and some big cemetery on a bluff, which of course is very picturesque and a lovely place to go and visit your dead relative, just slid right off into the backyards below. And there were newsreels showing these caskets just like sticks from a flood. Only they're in
there's
their
just
caskets.
a bunch of them.
They're just they were just like crisscrossed and ended, and I'm sure some of them burst open and bodies came out. I cannot imagine that it wouldn't be the case. Oh, horrible. So we know you can do it. It's legal. Some places make you go in and tell them you're going to bury a dead body in your yard, and then they put down in their records that your backyard is a cemetery. So there's a difference between a cemetery and a graveyard. A graveyard is like a church or municipal area that's set aside for graves. A cemetery is just where there's a grave.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is that how it is everywhere? Is that the official, like in English, the distinction between the words?
I think that it
cemetery has a body. A graveyard
this is the definition. A cemetery is a place where the remains of dead people are buried or interred. The term graveyard technically refers to a burial ground within a churchyard or a burial ground connected to a church property. Oh, only churches.
So wait a second. That means what is it? Mausoleum is not a graveyard. It's a cemetery.
Well, actually, according to this, if a graveyard only is burial grounds within a churchyard or connected to a church property, then that means that almost all of the cemeteries I've ever been in were just cemeteries.
Yeah.
Because there was no church connected to it. So a mausoleum would just be a cemetery.
So cemetery is the word to use.
Yes, cemetery.
So
graveyard is a church.
Our yard is a cemetery.
Our yard is a cemetery.
But not a graveyard.
But not a graveyard. Yes. Oh, my word. Before the 1900s, Americans often practiced burial at home, especially in rural areas.
Yeah.
And I can think
Makes sense.
I can think of several reasons why people would do that. So one thing is that they would have a plot that's where their family members were buried. So their family members are all together buried in the same place on the family land, probably land they expect to own for the rest of their lives. But another reason could be that burial plots are expensive. Or it could be that it'd be a distance away and they wouldn't be able to get there and visit it frequently. Or it could be that the person died from suicide and some graveyards associated with the church did not allow suicides to be buried in the regular part. I know it. That is archaic. I don't believe they do that anymore.
What even would be the point of that?
Because I don't know. They couldn't be in sacred ground.
They're still like the person. So we're talking about Christian graveyards. The person still is saved, right? They agreed with the stuff and went through the process.
I don't know. Don't look at me. I don't know. I think it's crazy. I don't think they do that anymore. I think that if you die and you're dead, you can be buried. I mean, if you belong to a church.
Probably. I mean, depends on the church,
Yeah. Well, if you're, I don't know.
You
I
could
don't know
be
enough about
buried
churches, so.
in a non-church cemetery, but not necessarily a graveyard.
Yeah. In the 1800s, funeral homes began to be commercialized. So that's, like we had our episode about funeral homes last time. So they are definitely professional establishments. They, that like we talked about all the weird decor, they are definitely plying their trade, and it is a professional establishment. So that probably had a twofold effect. The people who identified that as being a commercialization of death might have said, I'm not going to be part of that. I'm going to bury grandma in the backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And the other people might have said, this is a cleaner, more professional way of dealing with this very sad thing. And so they went with the funeral homes. And now we just think funeral homes are what you have to do, and you don't have to do it. You can bury grandma in the backyard.
If it's legal.
It is legal because we don't live in Indiana, California,
so
or
here it's
Washington.
legal.
Yeah.
I wonder what it's like in other countries.
Well, in India, you can bury someone, burn them on a pyre. You can do whatever you want.
We know they can do some weird
float them down the
stuff.
river till they get stuck on a sandbar.
Or like in Tibet or wherever it was, where
they lay them out on a stone.
Let buzzards or some bird.
I don't know, some
eat
birds.
them.
Yeah.
And then they grind up the bones.
Yeah.
And then birds come back and eat that too.
Ugh. Okay, before the commercialization of funeral homes, burials always took place at homes on private property or in community cemeteries and maybe even church cemeteries, church graveyards. But you didn't have a funeral home that was the intermediary between the death and the burial. That's the biggest difference. You know, like we talked about, Mormons in their culture, they prepare the body. Back then, everybody prepared the body. That's what they did. And then funeral homes commercialized the whole death thing so that when somebody died, they shipped them off to the funeral home. For a while, then they'd take them and send them to the church, and then the church would bury them. But now they don't even do that. Now the funeral homes usually have a cemetery attached to them or a mausoleum or something. So while home burials are not very common now, they are still legal, they are still happening, and it is not that unusual to find a grave in your yard, as we know.
It's interesting. Was it legal? Was it more or less legal in the past, like 100, 200 years ago?
I don't think there were any rules about where you could bury a loved one. And I don't think that you had to have like a coroner come out and declare them dead. And I don't know when they started having death certificates, but at some point, there was a point that they started doing that. Before that, there wasn't. You just, put out the word and everybody knew old Sam Smith down the road died, and that was that. So I think that the whole structure around death has changed a lot. So yeah, I don't know. Another interesting thing is there are no state laws that require the use of a casket. But
you can just wrap them and throw them.
You could wrap them in a burial shroud. You could put them in an eco-friendly casket, like a cardboard one. You can make a vault and not have a casket. A vault is the concrete little box. You can do whatever you want. But cemeteries have rules. And most cemeteries will say they have to be buried in a casket, or they have to be embalmed, or they have to that. There's not a state law. It's the cemetery's law.
I mean, it's strange, like for instance, why would they demand they be embalmed? You know what I mean? They don't actually have anything to do with that. It's just like when the body shows up.
Well, no, they do, because most cemeteries now are connected to a funeral home. And the funeral home is where they do the embalming. So if they say to be buried in our cemetery.
So like that, it's a business decision, which is pretty fucked up.
And I know, can you imagine? You're devastated because your loved one just died, and you go in and they show you
they have to suck out the blood and put in like plastic and shit.
And
like they have to.
This casket only costs $5,000. You want the best for your mother, don't you?
Yeah.
So spend $5,000 on this hunk of wood and metal that's going to go in the ground, and you're never going to see it again. That's just, I just think that's horrible. That's horrible, preying on grieving people.
That's what happens,
just
though.
Horrible.
People take their profession, optimize it, and then go beyond that and start making really, I'd say, relatively unethical decisions. Like, it evolves over time, you just accept it.
Yeah.
If somebody started certain businesses as they are now 400 years ago, they'd be like, whoa.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. There's There's a lady, what is her name? Her last name's Doty. Can't think of her first name. She's the mortician lady on YouTube. Oh, I thought I'd force you to watch some of her videos.
I don't think
she does
so.
Awesome videos. I can't think of her first name. Anyway, she is promoting green funerals, meaning that you're using, the family is preparing the body, you're using your own materials to wrap the body or build a coffin or, make one out of cardboard or buy a cheap one or whatever, something that's degradable. And she talks about some of those different methods, like letting a person just decompose. There are forests where, I don't think in America, I don't know where they are, but there are forests where you can do that, and you wrap your loved one's body up and you take them and just lay them out in the forest and you walk away.
This is an interesting thing to me about that. So, if, let's say, you like develop a process, you just completely plasticize the body, it's completely static after they die. So, and you could just put them on the wall. They're completely, immovable. They don't degrade at all.
Okay.
So if there's any process that they experience from their perspective after death that gradually integrates them with the larger system of reality, and that their perception expands or whatever,
okay, then
that presumably wouldn't happen when they're their body's completely static.
That's making the assumption.
A lot of assumptions.
Yeah, that's making an assumption that whatever that ethereal part of them
connected to the body, and it has to. So, and just looking at it like entropically, that like physically there is something that happens for you to expand your, But if you just like let somebody decompose, they immediately start evolving into other stuff. For instance, like the Tibetans, after the vulture eats the body, now it's flying around and it's essentially spreading them as it excretes. Mm-hmm. So it actually, there's a kind of a logic to that. Mm-hmm. Though, in a sense, in a different way of looking at it, if you completely plasticize somebody's body so it is not changing, then maybe that preserves their perspective longer or something.
I think that, number one, the thing about the Tibetan bird thing is so horrific.
To me, I was thinking, okay, if you were the monk that had to like cut off their skin or whatever, which they do.
Yes.
Okay, how long do you have to meditate for that to be acceptable? I don't know. This is a person you knew.
Yeah.
And now you're cutting off their like face and skin and shit.
And laying it out for the birds to be able to
And then you're watching the birds eat the thing, or maybe they don't watch them, but I don't know. It seems
I don't know that
messed up.
One video we were watching, it looked like it was pretty close to the monastery, like within sight of it.
Makes
so
sense.
They could sit out there having their morning tea, meditating, watching the
buzzards eat
their friend.
Yeah, I don't know. And then you have to take the bones and grind it up.
I thought that was pretty
horrific. It takes a pretty massive reframing from my perspective to that perspective of like, yeah, this is totally cool.
What's that big river that the Indians put the bodies in?
Oh,
I have to look it up because I don't want to say it wrong. Ganges River. How do you pronounce it? Ganges. Pronounce. Ganges. Okay. The thing we'd seen about the Ganges River, where the Indians put their loved ones in it when they die, of course, and just float them down the river. And they think that they're just making them be one with God. And then those explorers, or whoever they were, the travelers, who went down the river in a boat and found the sandbar with the bodies all kind of stopped up on it, and the birds eating the bodies.
It's kind of, it's more one with nature, literally. Like, you are now a part of those other things because they ate you.
The people in India are not stupid. So they have to know that when they put a body in the river, it is not going to become one with God. It is going to float down the river. And if they live on the banks of this river, they know there are sandbars. And if they live on the banks of that river, they know that things get caught on sandbars.
No, physically, they see them. They must see the bodies.
And bodies that were dropped into the river upstream, they're probably getting caught on the sandbars in front of them. So how can you reconcile that?
One, it's a religious practice or cultural.
I think it's more cultural.
Cultural. They know it. They accept it. And it's kind of like because they've been exposed to it, and probably some of them disagree with it. I mean, it's like, oh, Americans, they all want to be embalmed, you know. No, some people disagree with it.
Okay, so I can see from an environmental standpoint why it makes more sense to dispose of a body in a way other than taking a piece of land and saying this piece of land forevermore can do nothing else but hold this dead body in it. I can see that. I understand that. It's just for the people who are left behind when somebody dies to watch a bird pick their loved one to pieces, or to know that their loved one is lying naked on a sandbar down the river where fishermen are going to go by and say, oh, there's that old lady from the other village. There she is laying there naked and dead, and birds have poked out her eyeballs. To me, that's just so disrespectful. So completely disrespectful.
Yeah. But they might say it's respectful.
So is it disrespectful or respectful to bury your father in the yard?
There are septic tanks.
What? What does a septic tank have to do with it?
Are you talking literally or figuratively? Because literally, there are septic tanks in the yard in Wisconsin. Figuratively, if you're talking about just anyone's father, then... Yes,
in anyone's father, not your father in particular.
I mean, there are...
We're not going to drop your dad down the septic tank hole.
that does beg the question. If there are septic tanks, is that more or less okay to bury them near the septic tanks? You know?
Oh my God. Okay, I think we're gonna. I think we'll
rein it in.
That's the background of graves in yards, and it's legal, and it happens. So the fact that we have a grave in a yard is not apparently that unusual. Next episode, we will discuss the particulars of the grave in our yard and whether or not we believe the contents of that grave is haunting us. And thanks to you listeners for coming along today and listening to us go on and on about dead bodies and vultures eating eyeballs. On Saturday, part 2 of this episode will come out where we talk about our grave. Our contact information is in the show notes. You can email us, text us, or even call and leave a 3-minute voicemail. And as always, if you have a story you want to tell, send it to us. Please share, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and never be so terrified you can't run.